wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. I'm very pleased that all of you can be with us this morning to address an issue that is crucial to all Americans and yet is one that receives all too little attention: the impact of those wars not only on our service members but on their families and their communities. Most of us monitor these distant wars through the media or perhaps through contact with a friend or acquaintance who is serving, but for military families, the wars are a constant daily reality, something that is constantly in their thoughts and in their hearts, whether in the form of worry about a soldier or sailor or Marine who is stationed abroad, or concern for a service member who has returned home and is in need of care. Much has and will be said about the service members and their contributions to and sacrifices for our country, and that is only fitting. But today it is their families who command our attention, for they constitute the centerpiece of soldiers' support, as I think all of our speakers are going to soon tell you. These families often remain in the background, though. We know too little about them. Yet without military families, all of the services and programs that are in place for our service members would not be able to function or would not function as successfully as they do. And like the service members themselves, these families also need support. The goal of this conference is to seek a better understanding of what the families of today's military are facing, what services and programs are in place for them, and how these might be coordinated or improved in order to allow family members to, in turn, to provide the kinds of support they would like to be able to offer their loved ones. Before introducing our keynote speaker, let me just say a few words about the Wilson Center and how this conference fits in with our program. The center, as you may know, was founded in 1968 as a living memorial to our 17th president, and in keeping with his unique biography, he was the first and so far only president to hold a PhD. Its goal is to bring together scholars, policymakers, advocates, and others in public life to address key issues of public policy. The emphasis is on creating dialogue between people who bring a range of different perspectives to any given issue. As you can see for the program, today's conference reflects this approach as it gathers together academics who have studied military families, members of both government bodies and voluntary organizations who are concerned with service members and their families, and importantly, representatives of organizations that have been formed by military families themselves. We're confident that this mix will be a productive one, and we thank you all for being part of it. I'd also like to acknowledge the many people who've worked on this conference. My interns, Aldo Prosperi and Megan Sigovich, who are here and there, who will be handing around mics in a few minutes, who've helped put the program together. Mike Easterly, an intern who was working here in the fall, who's gone on to a permanent job, but whose research provided important background for our planning. And my extremely hardworking and long-suffering assistant, Richard Iserman, who many of you have been in touch with, who has handled all the logistics and resolved many problems, large and small, with skill and immense good humor. Thanks to all of them and to the entire staff of the Wilson Center, the many people behind the scenes who handle AV, publicity, catering, finances, and everything else that goes into putting together such events. They are true professionals, and it's a pleasure to work with them. Many thanks also to the Rabin program at George Washington University, which is co-sponsoring today's conference and helped to publicize it. And last, but certainly not least, to Charles Dubroff, who's sitting in the back there, not only for his generous financial support, but also for his inspiration. Chuck, who is a member of my family, has long been concerned with military families, and over the years he's done a great deal to assist them. And it was in a conversation with him at a family event last spring that the idea for this conference was hatched. He has offered many practical suggestions along the way, providing key contacts, and we're very grateful to him for all he has done to make this conference possible. Our keynote speaker, Brigadier General Loree K. Sutton, brings a unique perspective to her position as the highest-ranking psychiatrist in the U.S. Army. She's director of the Defense Centers of Excellence for Psychological Health and Traumatic Brain Injury, an agency that she helped to found and to create and to build from the bottom up. And she also serves as special assistant to the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Health Affairs. Before assuming her position at the Centers for Excellence in November of 2007, she had worked for more than 20 years as a clinician and an academic in both civilian and military life. General Sutton has written very wisely, quote, "The invisible wounds of war are not new to our warriors, veterans, and their loved ones. For many, coming home is not the end of war, far from it. Leaving the battlefield far behind The war often continues in hearts and minds, relationships and communities following deployment," unquote. A person with great insight into the issue of military families, the Army is very fortunate to have General Sutton serving in this critical position, and we are very privileged to have her with us today. Please welcome Brigadier General Loree K. Sutton.
Well, thank you so much, Sonia. It really is a privilege to be here with you all this morning and to look around the audience and see old friends, new friends, friends that I haven't yet met. And it reminds me, it gives me great courage and strength to remember that we truly are all in this together. And I particularly want to recognize up front, I want to recognize Justin Constantine. Justin, thank you so much for being here. You are still powering through your war wounds and injuries and just continuing to do things for the greater good. I also want to recognize Christy Kaufman, who I understand her Washington Post op-ed about a year ago, Sonia, you told me, was actually one of the real spurs for the genesis of this conference. Justin, Christine, the two of you are my bosses. That's who I work for. That's why we exist. That's why we're all here today. So thank you for your perspectives and for being here. Let's just take a few minutes. What I'd like to do with you today is I'd like to share with you a little bit of what we're doing at the Defense Centers of Excellence on this journey. Yes, we've come a long way in the last little over 2 years, but we've got so much ahead of us, and I'd like to share with you as well as to engage with you and to get your ideas. I can't tell you what what a privilege it is to stand here in the Woodrow Wilson Center and to summon the wisdom, perhaps President Wilson, to get started today. President Wilson, who said, "Who shall live up to the great trust? Who dares fail to try?" I think those words are as germane to our mission, our challenge today, as they were when he first spoke them. And so what is our challenge? Our challenge is that, as Secretary Gates has said, we are in uncharted territory. At year 9 of this conflict, never in the history of our republic have we ever placed so much on the shoulders of so few on behalf of so many for so long. And so we really must be willing to go where we have never gone before, to cast a wide net, to understand that not everything that we do or try is going to work, but that the path, the road to success, is paved with failures that we learn from. And so this has been a journey of many, many efforts on the parts of so many, and I would like to just start it out with recognizing our family members and sharing with you a 5-minute clip that comes from our Real Warriors campaign. This is a national public health campaign that we launched almost a year ago in our effort to eliminate stigma, that toxic, deadly hazard which all too often prevents our warriors and their loved ones from stepping forward to get the help that's available. And Richard, you tell me that if I press, there we go. Is the lights down?
Things are so nice when you come back initially, then the regular life sets in. You start having trouble sleeping and thinking about your past experiences.
I lost a lot of sleep, and so I started compensating for that by drinking so that I could sleep.
I was distant from everybody in my family. The room could be filled with people that I loved and cared about, and I'd be over here thinking about what happened to me or to some of my fellow Marines in Iraq 3 months ago.
I would get angry at things, I would get frustrated.
I was angry at everything and everyone.
My anger from work would carry over. Never physical, I just wanted them to go away because I didn't want them to be part of what was going on with me.
I was concerned that what is she going to be like when she gets back? Is she going to be the same woman I married, and how is it going to affect her? I think every spouse goes through that to some extent. What is my spouse going to be like when they get back?
The person who left is not the person who's going to come back. Just as the spouse is not the same person who you left at home, things change. They mostly change in a positive direction, honestly. And over time, you see that. But you got to understand that you're not going to be the same person afterwards that you were before you deployed, and don't try to be. Accept who you are, accept what's happened, accept that life experience, and now figure out how to move forward and make that positive.
You're really trying to figure out what the new normal is for the relationship, and you've both grown, you've both taken on more responsibilities, and it's hard to get back to living as a couple again, and so it's recognizing that that's going to be the case, and you're going to go through that adjustment, and then figuring out how to communicate in a way that works for both of you. We had a reunion of our unit, and it was an aha moment for me. You'd hear these spouses say, "Is your husband doing that? My husband's doing that too. I thought it was just us." And you know, really understanding that, hey, this is a common experience.
Spouses need to have a better understanding of what their soldier's been through. And I learned more to listen to what he was saying. I was hearing stories from the beginning to the end, where before I just heard bits and pieces. And that made it easier for me to understand where his pain was coming from.
I didn't throw all the gore and the ugliness in it, but I was able to tell her right up front when I came home, honey, here's 2 or 3 things that I've been through. They give me nightmares periodically, and when I didn't feel good, I would tell her. Just to prevent an innocent family interaction, normal arguments that you have in the home, from escalating to something stupid.
Sometimes all he needed was just for someone to sit quietly with him, and other times he just needed to be left alone, then come out and rejoin the family on his own terms and on his own schedule. We never pushed, and I always explained to the children, you know, let's give Daddy some space today, or conversely, give Daddy an extra hug today because he really needs one.
When you see the cloud coming over, back down just a little bit. It's not that big a deal if he doesn't take the trash out. You did it for a year to 15 months. It's not going to hurt you to do it one more day. It's not that big a deal if he doesn't get the yard mowed when he said he's going to. Just give him time to work through it. They'll talk. They'll open up more. You just have to be patient.
Initially, when I was getting ready to come back, I was very angry and was afraid of what I would face when I came back, people asking me questions, and I felt like I did not want to talk about it. I didn't want to talk to anybody. But then when I came back, I realized I really wanted to tell my story.
You definitely know something's bothering you from a deployment you've been on or something you might have seen over there. It's up to you. If you want to get better, you can get help and get better. When I went to get help, I had more help than I could have asked for from my mom and dad, my entire command.
I get the majority of my support from my Air Force family, and I've got some great friends that saw a big change in me that I could not see myself, and they encouraged me to get the help that I needed, and I'm so glad I did it.
It takes absolute real strength to deal with your own emotions in a mature manner, admit to yourself what you have been through and the challenges that you face, and to step in and encourage others to do it and get them to people that can help.
It takes real strength when families send their loved ones off to war, and to know that what you do at home is important in maintaining your health, your mental health, and giving them a soft place to land when they come home.
We're just in the first year of this campaign. I think you'll agree with me that hearing the real stories of real warriors, both on the home front, on the battlefront, fighting battles and struggling with wounds that are both seen and unseen, and moving forward to claim that real strength that is there for any of us as human beings on this journey of life, journey of healing, and to be able to share that story. Sometimes folks say, "Hey, General Sutton, that's not what it's like out there. That's BS." So I know that's not what it's like everywhere. If that was what it was like everywhere, we wouldn't need the campaign, right? But this is our North Star. These are real stories. They are not scripted. These are not actors. These are volunteers who have come forward and who have exercised the courage and strength to tell their stories. And the response has been really striking. Nielsen Ratings contacted us in February and said, "Do you realize that this campaign has now surpassed its 1 billion threshold for number of media impressions?" And it's very humbling. We're going to press forward, and we look forward to broadening and deepening this campaign in the months and years to come. So if you want to learn more about it, go to realwarriors.net. We've got resources there. We've got chat function that can link you to our 24/7 outreach, trained consultant coaches who are there every day, all day, passionate, many of them with family experiences in the military, many of them having been in uniform, and just so eager to help. 866-966-1020. We know that these wounds are real. We know that our most important message for our warriors, for those who are courageous enough to love us in uniform, and yes, we know this is more than the military, more than the VA. This is about all of us as a nation. We send our treasure, America's sons and daughters, to war, and it is up to each of us to be part of this effort of healing and growing stronger as a result. So, where are we? We are a little over 2 years into this journey. The Defense Centers of Excellence is an organization that was founded actually out of the incredible work that Dr. Shelley McDermott, as the co-chair for the Mental Health Task Force, she and her team, as well as others from the Department of Defense with the various task forces, commissions, the White House commissioned a group as well, great Americans who stopped what they were doing in that very difficult time in early 2007 when we realized that during the first years of this conflict, we really aimed forward. We were focused very much on saving the lives of those who never would have been saved in previous conflicts. And we became very, very good at that with the Air Force care in the air, intensive care in the air, with our medics, our corpsmen, who were trained to resuscitate and stabilize and get those casualties. Justin, I know you're so thankful for that training and for that great team effort. Get them to our combat support hospitals and then stabilized at launch tool, and sometimes within 24, 48, 72 hours back here on the home front at Walter Reed, at Bethesda, San Antonio, where they got just incredible care. But we were reminded that with this complex constellation of injuries, after all, the signature weapon from these conflicts is blast. And out of blast injuries come a very complex constellation of concerns that include those which are visible: burns, amputations, penetrating head injuries, as well as those which are not so visible, whether that be hearing injuries, visual impairments, sensory and balance problems, internal injury to organs, or in the case of the brain, traumatic brain injury, concussion, and psychological health concerns that include post-traumatic stress, as well as a host of other conditions, depression, anxiety, substance use. And all of those come together in the experiences of our warriors and their family members as they work together to heal, to keep hope on the horizon. We're at one of those moments in military medical history where, as so many times before, while none of us would wish to be at war, of course not, least of all those of us who know just how ugly war really is, but we are at war. And in the case of this conflict, what we are now learning about the human brain and how mind, body, spirit, the psychological, the physical, the moral, the spiritual injuries of war. As our Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Mullen, has said so many times, all of these injuries are on a par. All are equally important, and we must relate to our warriors and their loved ones as whole human beings. We must engage our warriors and our families. We must ask them questions. We must learn from their experience. We must understand the experience of warriors, the difference between the warrior who's out on patrol, like Sergeant Patton, who was up at Brooklyn last week at one of our theater at war performances. And he said to me, he said, "Ma'am, you got to understand what it's like, the difference between being out on patrol to the gap that resides in the FOBs, the forward operating bases, to the further gaps that reside at the palaces, to the further gaps that reside coming all the way back to Washington, D.C. And likewise, Christy, when I had the chance to sit on the same panel with you at the Congressional Family Caucus, which has just recently started this last year, and to agree that this is our opportunity to learn from our family members, to ask the questions. More importantly than asking the questions is to ask about the questions we've asked. Are they the right questions? And then to listen. And more important than listening is then to act. And so here we are. We're learning, we're listening, we're asking, and we're moving forward together. Our framework from the very beginning, it's a simple framework: resilience, recovery, and reintegration. We knew that this challenge was much broader than the medical model. And so, in military parlance, yes, we knew that our area of expertise was in recovery, helping folks recover who never would have recovered before. And now learning about that complex rehabilitation and recovery and lifelong, culturally and developmentally appropriate reintegration into communities of choice to live lives of purpose, passion, and meaning. That's what we owe America's best who have put themselves in harm's way. And so we knew that we had to get to the left of recovery, and we had to start with resilience and building resilience from the first day of a session for both family members and warriors. And I will say our challenge extends beyond that. At a time when only 3 out of every 10 young Americans aged 18 to 25 is even eligible to wear this uniform, we have a resilience challenge, a national challenge that has national security implications, global productivity, and health and well-being impact for our society as a whole. We also knew that we needed to get to the right of recovery, to reintegration. Whenever possible, to be able to help warriors reintegrate into their units to resume the lives of service that they signed up for, by the way, at a time that they knew our country was at war. Well before the economy went south, folks like Justin and his peers were saying, "Here I am, send me. We owe you our best." So let me just take a couple of minutes then to share with you some of the leading actions that we have going on right now, and then I'd like to open it up for comments, questions, discussion. This is where the real learning, where the real fun begins. I will tell you that beyond everything that we knew needed to be done, and that Shelley and her colleagues and others had outlined for us in the several hundred recommendations that were accepted by the Department of Defense back in 2007, and then the subsequent NDAA language for the last 3 years, as well as other needs that we have spotted and we have identified and moved forward to support the services in executing. We knew that for as much work as it would be to develop this one center, open front door, an integrating place for bringing together the best of breed leading practices across the spectrum in resilience, in standards of care, in training and education, closing the knowledge gaps for research, as well as outreach and community partnerships. We knew that underlying our efforts fundamentally would be the challenge of supporting our senior leaders in transforming the culture. You know, some wag said several years ago, culture eats strategy for lunch every day of the week. Believe it. It really is all about the culture and working together to create a healing milieu, a therapeutic environment that is embedded in an atmosphere of respect, of honor, of trust, of courage, and of strength. So let me just share with you a couple of things, starting with resilience. We're very excited this year to be able to work in unprecedented ways with the VA, moving forward on an integrated mental health strategy that has come out of the Mental Health Summit that was kicked off by both secretaries last fall. We're working on a resilience pilot engaging all of the services, the Army with its comprehensive soldier fitness program, bringing in also the Gallup Strength Finders 2.0 program, the Human Performance Institute, the Magis Group, a number of resilience programs that will be united with baseline information that ties back to the work on well-being and engagement. We're very excited about this. We're including family members and, in fact, looking to include civilian members of our workforce as well. We've also done some exciting work. Some of you may have seen recently the Sesame Workshop. I'll tell you, you have not lived until you see the picture of Admiral Mullen and Deputy Secretary of Defense Lynn standing there with Elmo and Rosita. And if you go up to the DCoE website, dcoe.health.mil, you'll see it. But it's a sign, is it not, that really we are in uncharted territory. Who could have imagined that just a few years ago? But we understand that we must go where we have never gone before. We must summon partnerships and reach out to Elmo, to Rosita, to reach out to the ancient Greeks and to learn from their experience. And Nancy Sherman, I know that you're here, and I've just so enjoyed reading your book recently and learning from it. Thank you for what you are doing to tell the story and to make connections and to keep that hope on the horizon. So we've got much more to follow in the resilience area. We know that it's not enough to engage Elmo and Rosita. No self-respecting 8-year-old would ever admit to listening to Elmo. Many do, but no one would ever admit that. So we are moving forward so that we can fill the gap 8 to 18 years old. Joyce Razor, I know with your work with the National Military Family Association, you've been a battle buddy since the very beginning in this, and we know that our children are affected by this conflict. Just think of it, just to orient ourselves. The 18-year-olds who are currently getting ready to graduate from high school this year, they were 9 years old when 9/11 happened. This has been a formative experience that has absolutely shaped and formed and guided their thinking as they have grown up. And we must give them the best of what we have been able to learn about resilience, embedding leadership, psychological health, courage, strength at the heart of everything that we do to reach out to them and to listen to and understand and act on their needs. So more to follow on the resilience front. We just really started down this journey, and we've got much, much, much more work to do. On the recovery front, let me share with you one of the most exciting things, certainly in my now well over 20 years in uniform, is to be part of the partnership between our line leaders and the medical community to develop a couple of protocols. What we have done is we have converted the mild traumatic brain injury or concussion management clinical practice guideline, which we've had for a couple of years, but we've converted it working with the vice chiefs of staff of each of the services. We've converted it to become a mandatory event-driven protocol so that from the very point of illness or injury, that troop who is in a vehicle that suffers a blast explosion or is a dismounted patrol or who's in a building or just doesn't seem right, well, we're no longer leaving it to that young frontline squad leader to decide, do I believe in this stuff? Is it real? He seems okay. He's shaking it off. He wants to go back into the fight. No, we're not leaving it to that young sergeant's judgment. What we've done is we've summoned the best of neuroscience knowledge that is available right now. We've engaged the leading lights in the country on neuroscience, and we've developed a series of actions, both on the line leadership side as well as on the part of the frontline medic and the corporal and the corpsman, and bringing it all the way back to ensure that each individual gets the time that they need to heal from whatever it is that they've been exposed to, and not just on the concussion front. Shortly behind this protocol, which is just going through the final stages of sort of policy DTM completion, but it's already out there with a brigade, a pilot brigade from Fort Campbell. So we're already testing this. We're doing the education, supporting the services, and educating, tracking, treating, and training. And shortly to follow, we will have completed our psychological health and post-traumatic stress protocol, A little more complex, as you might imagine. There's not typically a discrete event, although there can be, that triggers psychological distress. But we're very excited about this because this will be a leading edge from the front lines to transform the culture that we know has been with us and is no longer sufficient. The suck it up and drive on military culture. Now, mind you, there are still challenges in life that really, in the short term at least, the best response is suck it up and drive on. But it's woefully inadequate to cover the range and the depth and the enormity of challenges facing those whom we love. Also on the recovery front, we're very excited. The NICO, National Intrepid Center of Excellence, which will be the hub of our network of networks. Think of it as the Mayo Clinic for Psychological Health and Traumatic Brain Injury. In fact, we've consulted with Mayo from day one. We're so fortunate to have been able to recruit one of the country's absolute leading behavioral neurologist, Dr. Jim Kelly, who's the director of NICO. It will be opening on the 24th of June. Bill White, who I know had to be called away with a family emergency and was not able to join us today. But the work that Bill White and Mr. Arnold Fisher have done with the Intrepid Fallen Heroes Fund to raise money from great Americans all over this country who want to be part of the solution. And NICO will be that hub that will be able to disseminate leading practices, leading knowledge, be the hub for our network of networks in ensuring excellence in care, healing in culture, and hope on the horizon. Moving on quickly to reintegration. Some of you saw the Hurt Locker recently, and I don't know that anything demonstrates the challenges, that sense of displacement our troops feel any better than the picture of Jeremy Renner, tough guy, EOD, daring down death every day, and comes back and is paralyzed in the cereal aisle. This is our challenge. Many of our troops, when they first deployed over these last 9 years, they were 18, 19, 20 years old. Their brains had not yet fully matured. Their prefrontal cortex, that part of our brain that helps us make executive decisions to exercise sound judgment, had not fully matured. There's a reason why we can't rent a car until we're 25 years old. And so after 2, 3, 4, or even last week, I was talking to a young warrior who's getting ready for his 5th deployment over these last 9 years. Part of our challenge is to understand better how those young brains, resilient brains, but how they have now wired in such a way that, in fact, many of our warriors describe feeling much more at home downrange than they do here. So the challenges of reintegration are huge. As a leading effort to meet those challenges, we've recognized that we can't do this alone in DOD and VA. We're working together as we never had before. Al Batras and his vet centers, we're putting them on steroids. I'll be downrange in country. I'll be in Reno next week with Al Batras at the 30th anniversary of the vet centers. And together we will tag team. We will show the new face of the vet centers and the VA and the DOD historic partnership, reaching out to transform to a community-based, peer-to-peer mentor model of courage, resilience, and strength. And it starts by empowering folks in the communities, and the open front door there is, of course, our vet centers. We've partnered with the USO, bringing in the Red Cross, Al Batras and his vet center, peer-to-peer mentors, Bonnie Carroll and her TAPS individuals. We've started with a leading-edge training program to train the USO staff members, both professional and volunteers, in a pilot program. The data from that came back very positive. We are now moving forward through all 140 USO lounges to provide not only the training to spot individuals who may be in distress, may be at risk, may be coming through the airports, either going back downrange, or perhaps they've gotten a Red Cross call, there's a family emergency, a death, a sickness, or perhaps they're just plain tired and wondering if they can go forward another day. That's what we're putting out in the USO lounges as one effort to be able to reach out, get our arms around troops when they are at risk, and to provide them resources, link them up, get them connected. And as part of that effort, we'll have a kiosk downrange, a pilot kiosk, which will include individuals from each of those organizations, surrounded by a pot of green bean coffee. Some of you know that green bean coffee is the Starbucks of Iraq and Afghanistan, and that will foster connections that will, I think, foster both resilience, build recovery, and yes, assist in reintegration. Lastly, I mentioned already the Theater of War program. Some of you perhaps saw the coverage of a couple of weeks ago. Fort Eustis hosted the debut performance of Ajax as a woman warrior. I will tell you, it is just amazing what this experience of telling the stories of Ajax, the bravest, most courageous of warriors from the Trojan Wars, who, in a fit of despair following betrayal, died by suicide. The story of Philoctetes, who was wounded, abandoned by his men for 9 years on an island, until they realized that they couldn't win the war without him, and went back to get him. These stories, these performances are going all across the country right now. The Niarchos Foundation is linked up with the USO. They've said, hey, DOD, you can't hog all this great Greek warrior culture. And so we are really on the leading edge, figuring out where to go from here with this. But it has been just enormously poignant to listen to the perspectives of our military communities, families, warriors, loved ones, and warriors from all conflicts who tell their stories in the context of these performances. I think with that, why don't I just close my formal remarks with a note of hope, because you know, on this journey, we know it's about culture, we know it's about change, we know that leading change is not for the faint of heart. But it gives me great comfort and courage to know that we've got a great nation and a great world that has been traumatized, that is standing behind us and wants to be part of the solution. So our messages to change, to transform this culture are very simple. You are not alone. The unseen wounds of war are real. Treatment works, and it's getting better all the time. Sooner is better. And lastly, reaching out is an act of courage and strength. And don't take it from me, take it from one of our great Navy SEALs who, in a recent USO On Patrol journal, was featured here with the note that he placed on his hospital door when he was severely injured, but he wanted to put folks on notice. Attention to all who enter here. If you are coming into this room with sorrow or to feel sorry for my wounds, go elsewhere. The wounds I received, I got in a job I love, doing it for people I love, supporting the freedom of a country I dearly, deeply love. I am incredibly tough and will make a full recovery. What is full? That is the absolute utmost physically my body has the ability to recover. Then I will push that about 20% further through sheer mental tenacity. This room you are about to enter is a room of fun, optimism, and intense, rapid regrowth. If you are not prepared for that, go elsewhere. That's the spirit of our warriors and their loved ones. That's the spirit of America. That's the spirit of Woodrow Wilson. So here we are. Together, let's keep after it. Thank you very much. I'd be happy to receive any comments, questions, discussion, or are we about...
Yeah, no, that's fine. We have, that's fine. And please indicate if you want to speak, and I'll call on you, and wait for a mic, and please introduce yourself, identify yourself. Questions, comments?
I see some great folks from the National Endowment for the Arts there. Any thoughts? You all have been battle buddies in this journey.
Well, we are really looking forward to searching for ways to work
Can you wait for the mic? Take the mic, yeah.
We are really looking forward to searching for ways to work together with you in the future. So we're very grateful to the Woodrow Wilson Center for educating us, helping us to learn more about the issues, and look for the places where we can interface. And we're looking forward to coming to a NICO and to coming to the opening and learning more in depth about the ways that all of the arts, visual, performing, literary, can continue to work with you. So thank you very much for all of your doing.
Well, thank you so much. You know, our bias from the very beginning, and by the way, I feel so fortunate. I attended a medical school, Loma Linda University, whose motto is to make man whole. So that has been my training, my background, and my very strong conviction is that culture and arts reside at the very heart of the healing journey. In fact, they're at the very heart of what it is to be human. So it's just a delight to work with all of you. I think we have another question. Yes, Dr. Sherman.
Hi, thank you so much for those moving words. I was wondering, just two quick things. One is, as someone at a university, there's so much more the universities can do to make families. We're just beginning to, at Georgetown, to recognize officially and through tuition help the needs of the veteran community. That's one thing. But I also just wondered, I also do some teaching at USIS to pre-deployment clinicians, and the issue has come up of resilience and kind of positive psychology, if you like, that might be making those who really do feel very suffering from PTSD sort of marginalized because they're not able to be as resilient as others. So I just wonder how you're handling that balance between the positive message and the recognition of the real suffering of some.
No, that's actually a very deep question, and it's one which I have pondered greatly. You know, historically, yes, the emphasis of medicine, both through the fields of psychology and psychiatry, the field of mental health really tended to be on the negative, on the pathology, on the deficits. And, you know, the positive psychology movement has completed that bell curve. Our strong conviction is that a strengths-based approach that incorporates the best of Eastern medicine, knowledge and wisdom, the best of Western knowledge and wisdom, so that we can bring together mind, body, and spirit, the best that we know of from conventional therapies, as well as reaching out to do the research and get the outcome data on things like Qigong, Tai Chi, yoga, acupuncture, and to bring it together in an integrated care model that relates to the individual as a whole person. Now, having said that, the point you get to in terms of folks who have been at this for a while and are feeling pretty beat up, a little worn down, and there's really no end in sight. That's something we hear very frequently. We also have, in combination with that cohort, we also have folks who are coming in. They've just come in, and they're eager to learn about resilience. And so it's a nuanced message that must be targeted carefully. We've heard this from our focus groups when we were getting ready to stand up the Real Warriors campaign. In fact, one family member told us, they said, you know, for those of us who have been in this from the very beginning, we don't want to hear about resilience right now. It makes us angry. It makes us feel guilty, like there's something we could have done that could have prevented us from looking like and feeling like we do now. And so it's a very different effort to understand that there are some who really do need some depth healing, some tools that can restore well-being and engage them with themselves, first of all, and their families and their communities, but then to be able to also bring on some of the tools of resilience that can foster the strength and courage, and that will be deep enough to encompass the depth of experience that war involves. You know, if I've lost my best buddy, and he or she has died in my arms, I don't want anyone to tell me to stop catastrophizing. That is a catastrophe. And yes, I will find the courage and the strength and the resilience to make meaning of that loss and to honor that life. But at the moment, It is a catastrophe that goes beyond the depths of anything that most of us as human beings will ever experience. And so I think to develop a very respectful sense of honor, of humility, and privilege. It is our privilege to witness to and minister for on behalf of those who have suffered so much. We don't have all of the answers. We're still looking to make sure we're asking the right questions, but we do know that the unseen wounds of war, which include the moral, the spiritual injuries, are even more deadly than those that are visible. So thank you for that comment, and I would love your continued ideas on the topic.
Yes, right here.
Hi, General Sutton. I
Could
just
you identify yourself, please?
Oh, Christy Kaufman. I'm apparently her boss. I'm an Army wife. Have been for about 9 years, and one of the things that I'm excited about is what DCoE is doing is really getting those best practices and trying the Fort Campbell or the Campbell pilot.
Fort Campbell, that's
correct.
correct.
I think it's really important as we're collecting all these best practices to really put them down on the line side. And I know that's culturally very difficult. I just wanted to comment on it's difficult enough to teach resiliency to the service members, but at least you can incorporate it into training. With the family members, it's much more difficult because you can't really make us do anything. And a lot of us, as you refer to, are tired. And to your point, what you were talking about, resiliency, I got an email after the op-ed ran from a young lady that said, teaching me how to be resilient after 9 years of war and 5 deployments is like teaching me how not to get raped after it's already happened. So I think that we're dealing with the young ones coming up and us old ones who would have been the support system for those young ones. And I think one of my biggest concerns is that the military has relied on family members to take care of other family members, which will work for maybe 1 or 2 years of war. So I think that when we're talking about best practices and how we relieve some of the stress on the family members, we have got to put those mental health resources down at the unit level. And not just the MFLACs, which are great, the Military Family Life Consultants, which are terrific, but there's one MFLAC for a brigade. So that's not going to have as much of a desired effect. Having the training, put it into the educational curriculum across the board, ANOC, BNOC, where the sergeants, the captains, how to support the family members, how to recognize the mental health. My sister has a TBI, and it's relatively mild, but it's changed. So those kind of things, how we get what you're doing into TRADOC. And I've spoken to General Dempsey about it, and I know it's supposed to be coming, but we are, 8 or 9 years in, and the fact that I'm training my husband's captains when they come in, I'm an unpaid volunteer, and I'm teaching them what their job is supposed to be. And that's a problem.
No, thank you so much, Christy. You're absolutely correct that to transform the culture, it's not enough for me to talk about it or you to talk about it or any one person or group to talk about it. It has to get into the DNA of our troops and our leaders and our family members. And that's at community level, that's at the National Training Center, that's at the Joint Readiness Training Center, that's throughout our curriculum as you've outlined. And that's exactly what we're working with the services now to absolutely accelerate and catalyze. In fact, I had a team down at TRADOC just this last week as they really push forward on recognizing and developing the human dimension of combat, both on the deployed front as well as on the home front. So would really look forward to your continued contributions to make sure that what we're putting out is relevant, that it's helpful, that it's not just another set of PowerPoint briefings, but in fact, it provides real tools to engage individuals where they are. And as I will just say, as we get ready for the 1-year anniversary this next month of the Real Warriors campaign, we put together some little flyers with 5 of these tools that we really want to get out there in the communities so that folks understand that right now today, not something that's going to happen, woulda, shoulda, coulda, 6 months from now, a year from now, 2 years from now, but right here today, The outreach center that I talked about, 866-966-1020. The live chat that's available on the realwarriors.net website. The video profiles that you were able to see, one of them that featured our families in particular. Also, the message boards. We've got chat boards, message boards, where we learn so much every day from individuals who come forward and say, hey, this is what's happened with me. It was really great and I want to see more of it. Or, this wasn't so good. Might have been well intended. But you know what? Good intentions are not enough. We need real results. And finally, the education in terms of the articles that are available. Is it enough? No, of course not. But part of it is Dr. McDermott and her team and Donna Shalala and so many others, Togo West, the individuals who came forward in those studies and task forces reminded us it's not enough to have a bunch of stuff that's just out there. Now, of course, you put a couple of $1 billion against a domain of issues, critical issues, and for a period of time you are going to have a proliferation. And that's where we are now. We have a proliferation of programs on the family front, the home front, the battle front, and as I've mentioned, all points in between. And many of those programs are just now coming to fruition and maturity. So now it's our opportunity to work with folks like RAND Corporation and others to put the outcome metrics against those so that we can really determine over these next couple of years what works for whom, under what conditions, why, how can we invest more in that, and then frankly to be able to divert resources from programs that, while they were no doubt well intended and seemed like a good idea at the time, they just simply haven't worked out as hoped. And there's no shame in that. And so that's the synchronization period that we are just moving into now, both on the research front. We are doing the knowledge gap and the evaluation this summer to really look at the leading returns on investment from the enormous number of studies and research efforts that have been addressing militarily relevant knowledge gaps all across the country and around the world, with NICO opening, that's going to be the hub of hubs, and as well as with our programs, to be able to simplify, to be able to support, to be able to honor those whom we serve. But we can't do it without your input, and we would be foolish to even try. So that's where your input and those of your peers and your peers, Justin, will continue to be invaluable.
There was a question back there. Yeah.
Thank you. Jeff Brune, Gallaudet University. I'm a historian of disability, and I want to follow up with the question asked earlier. And there's something that really bothered me about the end of your talk, and that emphasis on what historians of disability call the overcomer model. And this has been picked apart again and again and again, first by the disability rights movement, and which is filtered into scholarship. And the way that you spoke about that, for me, really echoes the approach to the treatment of polio in the 50s, which is in terms of being the overcomer of people supposed to stay positive rather than seek accommodations and have an acknowledgement of their disabilities. People with polio were taught to climb stairs, to do all these other things, and this was to disastrous consequences. And so I really hear a lot of echoes, especially in the way that you ended the talk, and I would like to urge you to maybe read some of that history, especially of polio, and I could recommend some books for you on that.
Listen, thank you so much. I would like to meet with you and to learn from that body of literature, and I do apologize if my remarks at the end in some way trivialized or made light of the experience of those who have been so deeply affected from this war. So please let me learn from you, and I will tell you, as I started out to say at the beginning, my bosses are right here, Justin Constantine and Christy Kaufman and their peers, and if there's one fear I have, it's that of doing or saying anything that would ever in any way disrespect their service, their sacrifice and their hopes for recovery, to adjust to that new normal, to recognize that war changes everyone just as disease does, and to recognize that, as one traumatic brain injury survivor shared with me when at one talk I was talking about some of the research that years ago identified, sort of the 3 C's, elements of resilient individuals, stemming from some of the research on executives who had been laid off, and who, prior to the layoff, to that adversity, there was no distinguishing between that group. But after that layoff, that adversity, they really bifurcated into 2 very distinct groups: those who thrived despite the adversity, and those who really had just disastrous impacts on their lives. And so, one of the C's was, and this is really something out of the Serenity Prayer, those who thrived were those who focused on what they could control. They embraced change as their friend, as difficult as that is. And they were committed to something that was much bigger than any of them as individuals, which is that connectivity. Well, this TBI survivor, and Teresa Rankin is her name. She's given me permission to talk publicly. She's such a hero of mine, and such a pioneer of the brainline.org tool that's available on the internet today. But she said, General Sutton, there's a 4th C that you need to add to that. She said, and that C is courage. She said, nobody ever told me after my traumatic brain injury that I would have to strap on courage every single day for the rest of my days on this earth, but that I could find a new normal, and I could find a way to thrive in the community, and to, in some ways, be stronger as a result of that experience. Not in a Pollyanna way. I hear you, and I want to learn from you, and I thank you for bringing up that point.
Okay, this will be the last question, please. Yeah.
Captain Sandy,
Thank
please.
you. Oh.
Can you bring the haikus, please? Oh. Yes, please.
Kathy Roth-Duquet, yet another boss for you. I'm a Marine Corps spouse. My husband's on his 3rd combat deployment right now in Afghanistan. But I think one thing I want to share is that all of us are out there touching the elephant and describing what it is that we see. So all of us have deeply held beliefs about how important talking about and focusing on resilience is, or how that's demoralizing and we can't handle it. The truth is all those parts of the elephant are there, and we need to really appreciate the diversity and focus on who needs what, when, and how. Right. We're also all very sensitive because we're exhausted. So I'm sure it's a very tough thing for you. Wherever you go, something you say is going to hit somebody wrong. I was at a meeting recently, and someone who works on warrior issues says, no one comes back from war undamaged. That offended me enormously, because we're an all-volunteer force, and we're doing something the country asks us to do. And if we're going to come back, no one's going to come back from war undamaged, then we just can't do it. I won't send my husband to do it for those reasons, and it's not right. So as much as some of us, need to talk about this experience in ways that are global, I think we have to also embed it within the idea that this is a public service that is necessary to our democracy. We ask some of our citizens to stand up to do it. It has to be something that strengthens you, at least some people, at least the majority of the people. Frankly, it's got to be the majority of it. Even with the struggle, even as it tears you down, I love the expression you used of regrowth, because we need to keep recruiting strong people, or else we need to just not do this. So I think we need to keep the embedded language. Being in the military is not getting polio. And being in the military sometimes means suffering, but being a person sometimes means suffering. I hope that the lessons that we learn here, just the way what we know from TBI is now helping high school football players who get brain injuries, I'm hoping some of this other psychological resilience lessons that we're learning can help the larger society. And I just wanted to share those comments.
Well, thank you so much for your comments as well. There are many dimensions to this, and so it's important for each of us to learn from each other, because there is no one set of answers that fits everyone's situation, and that, frankly, is part of the richness, the poignancy. I prefer to say that war changes everyone. And in fact, as a psychiatrist, I will tell you, the individual who goes downrange for 12, 15 months, does that, in fact, repeatedly, and comes back and says, oh, no, ma'am, hasn't changed me a bit. That's the individual I'm most concerned about. And the spouse and child as well. And so our challenge is to connect as human beings, fellow human beings, sharing our stories, finding hope where we can, finding that new normal, and then summoning the courage and strength to live in it. That's really what this journey is all about. And I'd just like to close with some of the wisdom, again, from our focus groups, our family members and our warriors, as we were putting together the Real Warrior campaign. And we condensed this, Sergeant Eubanks and I, my Alpha battle buddy, Marine Sergeant, who has taught me so much this last year. Let me just share these with you. These are the voices of those whom we serve. Full of life's promise, proud to don this uniform. Here I am. Send me. Our blood and treasure, our daughters and sons, brave and strong. Do we deserve them? I'm fighting for you, sisters and brothers in arms, brave hearts in harm's way. War followed me back. Desperate days, sleepless nights. Pain racks my spent soul. One trip to the mall is enough to convince me I am lost at home. Doc says treatment works, an act of courage and strength. Please don't break my heart. Suck it up, Sarge says. Wish that it were so simple. Teach me a new way. Why did this happen? My body and soul scream foul. Betrayal sinks deep. Respect yields true strength. Diversity is the glue. From the many, one. Show me a real man who got treatment and still leads. I need to believe. Babe, what you done now? Let's try that new normal thing. Please don't throw us away. You say you won't go, waging battles out of reach. Then do it for me. Who remembers us? Rusty magnets fraying flags, used and forgotten. Why am I still here? Guilt preys on lost innocence, tracking my heart's path. To murder or kill, just tell me the difference. My soul aches to know. Just back from the ledge, broken dreams and slaughtered hope, to try life once more. Tie my boots again, keep hope on the horizon. Never surrender. Daddy, where are you? I love you all the way to heaven, home, and me. Mama, I need you. Hair bows, cookies, and huge hugs are waiting for us. God, who am I now? Where in my hell have you gone? My soul begs for grace. Keep the faith, brave hearts. War has bonded us forever. All together now. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Okay, is this yours? Thank you so much. Thank you so much for taking time from what must be an enormously busy schedule to be with us this morning. We really appreciate it.
Let me just say, Sonia, you can be the first on your block. Every good military organization has a coin, and ours is no different. So we have a brain coin that you'll see is framed with real warriors, real battles, real strength, the family ties. Here's our warrior. There's the brain, body, mind, and spirit. Thank you so much for all you're doing. God bless.
Okay, thank you. Okay, we'll, people for the next panel, Jennifer Middlestadt and John Williams come forward. And let me quickly introduce our moderator for this panel, who's Kathleen Friedel, who is a fellow here this year. She's an assistant professor of history at UC Berkeley, and we're very fortunate to have her with us this year because she, among other things, is the author of a wonderful book on the GI Bill. So we were fortunate to be able to take advantage of her presence to moderate this panel and offer a little framing.
Thank you, Sonia.
Let's get everybody up here. Doesn't matter where we sit? Yeah, you can speak here if you want, but oh, okay. But why don't you sit first? Yeah, you should be. You'll get.
Let me just begin by saying in that litany of thank yous that Sonia enumerated, she forgot to list herself. So let me thank Sonia Michelle for today's event, which I think is very important. This first panel, as our panelists arrive, this first panel is devoted to a discussion of the larger political and social context in which we consider the military, including force structure, military benefits, and of course military families. And I think Sonia asked me to moderate this panel because, as she mentioned, I wrote a book on the World War II GI Bill, which I creatively titled The GI Bill. And she knows that I feel strongly about integrating the military into our most important intellectual and historical questions. And I just want to echo a comment that General Sutton made in her opening remarks by quoting a line from the preface I wrote discussing our tendency as scholars and really as a country to sequester the military from other important questions. And that line went, we as Americans are the fights we choose, the force we send, and the favors we bestow. And with that thought, I want to introduce our distinguished panelists. Jennifer Middlestadt is an associate professor of history at Women's Studies at the Pennsylvania State University. She is a political and social historian of the United States with an interest in gender and women, race and the state. Thank you. Race and the state. Her research focuses on the 20th century, social policy and politics, liberalism, second wave feminism, and most recently, militarization and the all-volunteer army. Her published works include From Welfare to Workfare, The Unintended Consequences of Liberal Reform, 1945 to 1965, a book I hugely admire and learned a lot from, and Welfare in the United States, A History with Documents. She is currently at work on a book that situates the post-1973 all-volunteer military's benefits as part of the history of the welfare state, poverty, and politics in the late 20th century United States. And then we have John Allen Williams, a professor of political science at Loyola University, Chicago. He is chair and president of the Inter-University Seminar on Armed Forces and Society, and editor of the National Strategy Forum Review. He is on the board of directors of the Pritzker Military Library and past president of the International Security and Arms Control Section of the American Political Science Association. Dr. Williams' latest book is U.S. National Security, Policymakers, Processes, and Politics. Previous books include The Postmodern Military, Armed Forces After the Cold War, Soldiers, Society, and National Security, and The U.S. Army in a New Security Era. He is a retired captain in the U.S. Naval Reserve with 30 years of commissioned service. Unfortunately, the Honorable Joan Evans was unable to make it today and join us for this first panel. So each of our panelists have been told to speak for about 15 minutes. but because of this last-minute cancellation, I won't be interrupting anyone mid-sentence. But I will probably try to give you, let's say, a 2-minute kind of warning, and then we'd be happy to open it up for questions. Jennifer, would you like to start us off?
Sure. Well, I want to start by saying thank you. Thank you to Sonia for organizing this, and thank you to the Wilson Center for hosting what is already evidently a very, very important discussion. And I feel like I've already learned a lot hearing General Sutton speak and hearing some of the questions, and I'm hoping to learn a lot more as we go through the day. What I'm going to do, and I see my role here today, is play the historian. So I'm going to back up in time and try to provide some historical perspective on the Army's incorporation of military families. My own research is, this is part of a broader project that I'm doing that looks at the benefits and social services of the all-volunteer force. I focus specifically on the Army, and so my remarks today really are rooted in that history of the Army, though I think that a good deal of this history may also be relevant and applicable to the other services. Now, as you might imagine, an entire history of the benefits and social services of the Army would require an enormous amount of time, far more than the 15 minutes allotted to me. So rather than try to enumerate this history point by point, what I'd like to do is just extract two issues. I want to make 2 points today that I think are often overlooked in the discussion of military families today, and yet I find to be very important and relevant to that discussion. The first point that I'd like to make today is that historically speaking, the Army incorporated families because it had to, not because it wanted to. For centuries, the Army was able to meet its goals. Just trying to figure out how to move this forward. There we go. Will this move it forward? Where's Richard? This is fine.
The right button should do it.
The right button. Great, thank you. Historians are sometimes technologically challenged. So to get back to this, the Army incorporated these families because it had to, not because it wanted to. And see, I've already gone too far here. There we go. From the beginning of the Republic, from the founding of the Republic, young single men were the primary foundation of the Army. Army policies discouraged soldiers from having families. They discouraged marriage. And they were generally aimed at reducing the number of families. And this continued really for about 200 years. And it's only the massive manpower demands of World War II that changed this. Drafting so many men in order to win this war essentially required the Army to allow men who were married and men with children into the ranks. Now, this probably would have ended as soon as it began, except for the decision of U.S. policymakers to maintain a large standing Army in the Cold War and also to continue the draft. And so what this meant is that the World War II era policies that allowed men who were married and allowed men with children into the Army continued after that. What this did was produce a revolution in military life, so that by 1960, so this is pretty early on, military dependents, as they were called, wives and children, essentially, outnumbered military personnel. And the escalation of the Vietnam War tended to accelerate this even more. However, really, there's one thing above all others that increases the number of families, also sustains the number of families, and then forces the military, the Army in this case, to recognize those families and provide for them. And that is the switch to the all-volunteer force in 1973. With the volunteer force, of course, the Army sought career soldiers, right? Soldiers who would stay in who would form the backbone of the volunteer force. And of course, career soldiers would be much more likely, over time, to marry and have children than first-term or one-term enlistees. And so indeed, as you can see, by 1977, 6 out of 10 members of the armed forces were married, with over 80% of the officer corps married and 50% of enlisted personnel married. And by 1983, there were 1.5 times as many family members as actual military personnel. And what's remarkable is that, by and large, these statistics have sustained themselves over time. Now, although the Army had all of these families in its midst, the truth is that it did relatively little to support them for most of this history I've discussed so far. Indeed, the Chief of Staff of the Army, General John Wickham, in 1983, who issued a famous Army Family White Paper, admitted that despite the Army's World War II era slogan, with which many of you I think would probably be familiar, and that is, the Army takes care of its own, despite this slogan, the Army had in fact not taken care of its own. And in the White Paper, he says this, that the Army's willingness to acknowledge the critical role families play in its mission has moved from studied neglect through ambivalent and selective inclusion of families into the military community. So he's admitting really that there's not at all a stellar record of providing for all of these families in its midst. But really, with the coming of the volunteer force, people like General Wickham knew that this absolutely had to change. The neglect and ambivalence was going to have to give way to something else. Now, the impetus for making this change came from a number of sources, but I think in general, we don't recognize how much the impetus for actually recognizing and providing for families came from soldiers and from families themselves, particularly from spouses. So I'd like to talk just a little bit about that. When the Army surveyed its new volunteer soldiers, which it did quite a bit in the 70s and early 80s, when it wasn't at all clear that particularly for the Army, the volunteer force would be viable, they asked them what they wanted in order to be retained, in order to stay. And by and large, what soldiers told the Army that they wanted were benefits and services that allowed them to support their families securely and even comfortably. Soldiers' top demands, according to surveys from the time, were for economic security and protection, I'm quoting here, health care, and a family-friendly environment. And in case surveys weren't enough to convince Army leadership of this, about 1/3 of soldiers in the mid-1970s said they were very amenable to a move by the American Federation of Government Employers to unionize the military in order to protect and expand these benefits. They also made their voices heard in this respect about their desire for family support publicly in venues like this one, in Army Times. Here we have a staff sergeant who's writing into Army Times, basically talking about the failure of the Army to adequately support his family and wondering what does this mean for my future, for my family, and also for the future of the Army if this kind of necessary support is not provided. Now, at the same time that soldiers were making their voices heard to Army leadership and in public, spouses were as well. In 1980, the Army Officers' Wives Club of the Greater Washington area held a symposium that brought spouses from posts all over the world to Washington in order to discuss the problems of the Army family. Now, this symposium generated an enormous amount of attention from Army leadership, and the Chief of Staff of the Army came to it. And what they asked for, basically, was recognition. And they had a host of recommendations about how to create what they called a more reciprocal relationship between families and the Army, rather than a hierarchical, top-down, kind of one-way street relationship. And actually, the symposium produced a whole host of changes, including that Army Family White Paper that I referred to before, and then the Army Family Action Plan as a result. What was interesting to me when I was doing this research was that I found that that Army spouses were also fairly vocal as well in this period about what it was that they wanted. And this is a sample from a letter to the editor of Army Times, where basically she says, I've been hearing for years how the Army takes care of its own. I'd like to actually see you live up to that phrase. So the Army, I think, really did heed the voices of soldiers and wives, and it heeded its own research and its own knowledge, the knowledge of people like General Rickham, that told them basically, if we don't provide for soldiers' families, we're going to have a hard time making a go of the volunteer force and retaining these people. So it expanded many programs that already existed that did not extend down to the families of junior enlisted personnel. It expanded those. It also created many new programs. There, so many that I really can't go into them. Where's my pie chart? The pie chart's not there. But a whole host of programs that are quite enormous. My purpose here today is not to go through the details of what all of the programs are. We can talk about what some of them are, but most of you probably know what a lot of the programs are, ranging from benefits to social services. Rather, my second point today is that despite the Army's decision to heed the words of soldiers and families and to heed its own research and to make these changes and start providing supports and social services, my research tells me that a certain ambivalence and reluctance has nevertheless remained in the Army's support for families. And I think that this ambivalence and reluctance goes largely unrecognized. Now, it occurs in a wide variety of ways, but I don't have time to go into all of them today. And so I'm going to talk to you about one of the ones that I find the most striking. And I think probably it pertains a little bit to some of the discussion that went on after General Sutton's comment. There's been a growing emphasis within the Army since the early to mid-1990s on promoting self-sufficiency among soldiers and families. What I mean to say, to be explicit, is that I think that the Army has sought to shift the burden of care and readiness, in their words, off of the Army to some degree, even though it only had just recently taken responsibility for doing something, to shift that back onto soldiers and families themselves. Now, the shift has several sources. And I can talk more about what those sources are in the 1990s. But one of the ones that stands out most to me and pertains most directly to Army families is some of the obscure history of the beginning of Army family support groups, which are now called readiness groups. So for those of you who are not familiar, FSGs, or FRGs as they're called, are organized at the unit level for spouses. They rely on the unpaid volunteer labor of spouses in order to provide a kind of intangible sense of community and mutual support and aid. Also, to provide information. There's usually, especially in the case of deployment, a rear detachment commander who's assigned to it. More recently, there's a lot more professional staff, but we'll talk about that later. For many years, there was not. And they will also provide basic service referral. If there's a family that's in need of special services, service referral is supposed to be something that an FRG or FSG leader can provide. So as I said, these were created during the 1980s, but the Army didn't really test drive them until the first Gulf War. And afterward, it conducted an after-action report on them. And I'll show you what this after-action report said. Even though the FSGs, as they were called at the time, really provided almost nothing in the way of actual services because of the fact that it was sort of a voluntary mutual aid kind of an organization, the Army nevertheless concluded that families had asked too much of family support groups, that they had asked too much of the rear detachment commander. They had expected a little bit too much in the way of support in the title Family Support Group. And so you see here, this is taken from that after-action report, where the people who were writing it concluded the Army creates unrealistic family care expectations. And then they they sort of took this right back to the Army's motto, which is the Army takes care of its own, leads to these expectations. Roles and responsibilities of the soldier family support group require clarification. So what this meant basically was that spouses had to be re-educated in really what the family support groups were going to provide, and that wasn't going to be as much as the spouses wanted. Rather, you can see the clear recommendation here. Redefine how the Army supports and assists families by emphasizing self-sufficiency and training. Make soldiers responsible for family readiness. Now, what was remarkable to me, and what has been remarkable to me, is that family support groups, which are really certainly not in terms of spending, even close to being a major proportion of Army family support, the determination made about this actually produced effects that went far beyond family support groups. And in fact, I think it helped effectuate a much broader change in Army philosophy. What you see in the mid-1990s, these are taken from the slides of Harriet Rice, who was Director of Morale, Welfare, and Recreation in the Army in the 1990s, you see a wholesale change in the Army's philosophy of how it's going to deal with families. So these are her slides that she takes on the road to posts across the world, actually. And you can see what it says. The Army motto, she's telling commanders, families, the Army takes care of its own is now going to be, in 1995, the Army takes care of its own by teaching its own to take care of themselves. And it focuses very much on self-reliance. Now, if you look at this more widely, she's not just talking about family support groups at all. She lists all family support here: community service, child development services, youth, Army Family Action Plan, the FSGs are there, Army Family Team Building. All of them now are within this rubric of empowering soldiers and families to be self-reliant. So it really is this wholesale reinterpretation of what Army family support means. As I said, this has been expressed in a wide variety of ways, but I think it's largely unrecognized. And needless to say, this desire for soldiers and families to be self-reliant has met a serious challenge in recent years. With the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, the Army's asked more of soldiers than ever, and their families have lived under greater stress than they ever have before. And while efforts like the Army Family... No, I do not want that. The Army Family... I got it. Thanks. This is General George Casey's Army Family Covenant, which he issued in 2007. And I realize now that I have it up on the screen that it's probably impossible for you to read, but it's really pulling back from this message of self-reliance. And it's a restatement pretty unambiguously that the Army will take care of its own. And notably, it also was backed up with funds, at least in the first year, about $150 million. And it included such things that families wanted, like, for example, professional staffing for FRGs. However, despite this, and despite the knowledge of the difficulties Army families are facing, there remains, I think, still an undercurrent of, oh shoot, my video didn't embed, an undercurrent of still a message of self-reliance. And I was going to show you the Army Family Strong video, which I can't show you now, unless there's magical internet connection, but it still might take me a while to get it up. Can you do that? Yeah. Well, this Army Family Strong video is really striking to me. What it does, it's part of the Army's campaign for sort of reaching out to families.
Jennifer, do you want to use that mic there?
Sure, I'll use this mic. It's part of the Army's campaign for reaching out for families. And has anyone seen it in here? It's called Army Family Strong. It's this incredibly moving tribute to Army families. And even though I've watched it now dozens of times, it sort of never fails to move me when I watch it. What is remarkable to me about it is the degree to which it implies that families are responsible for their own strength. and that they must bring this strength to the table. And except for one statement towards the end, it doesn't really say that the Army will take care of families, but rather that families need to take care of themselves. So through the magic of the internet, and with my extra time, I will now show this to you in the miracle of YouTube, and you'll be able to see it. So it's about 2 minutes, and I'll show it to you, and then I'll just have a word to say afterward.
Standing behind every soldier is an army of husbands and wives, sons and daughters, brothers, sisters, fathers, mothers.
When Chris is deployed, we try to be strong. We have to deal with things. Thank goodness for girlfriends and neighbors. I think the Army community has an incredible bond.
They wear a different uniform. Football jerseys, business suits, first pairs of shoes. Theirs is a uniform of strength. The strength to put a nation of families before their own. The strength of courage, integrity, and sacrifice. While the people closest to them are so far away.
Abby Sue, I miss you so much and I love you. Good night, I love you. Here's your hugs and kisses.
The strength of our soldiers comes from the strength of their families. Together, they are the strength of our nation.
All Army families are strong in their own way. The best thing about being an Army wife is pride. I have never been so proud in all of my life.
We will do everything we can to keep Army families Army strong. Families are strong. Army families are Army strong.
So I think you'll agree with me that that is an incredibly moving portrait. And it does celebrate, I think rightly, the strength of Army families and in a time of incredible pressure for them. But I also think, I hope that you're able to see that except for that one statement at the end that says, we will take care of Army families, the we is actually, even there, quite vague. And that the whole thing really is a celebration of self-sufficiency. And while there's certainly a place for self-sufficiency and self-reliance, I wonder from a historical perspective, and given the unusual historical situation the armed forces find themselves in now, if now is the appropriate time for that kind of a message to be sent out about Army families and their own responsibility for self-support. So thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. Dr. Williams.
Thank you, Richard. I was telling Sonia earlier that if General Schwarzkopf had been as organized as this conference has been, the war would have been over in 50 hours instead of 100. I'm very honored to be invited to be with you today, and it is always interesting to be back in the Beltway. Chicago is very far outside the Beltway, something we pride ourselves on. We have a feeling sometimes that there are things of concern in the Beltway that concern no one outside the Beltway. But this is not one of those issues. This is an issue that concerns everybody, and people really do care about it as they should. It is very important work, and it's difficult to talk after watching a video like that, I have to say. That was really very, very moving. What I propose to do today is not to try to teach you about a policy that you already know far better than I do. You are the policy experts. But as Charlie Moscas liked to say, you know, I'm a military sociologist and I'm here to help you. I don't know what the other two great lies are, but my mission today is to give you some overview, a context that I hope that you'll find useful as you think about these very important issues and help to implement them to benefit our military, their families, and ultimately our country. I'm going to take from three perspectives, as you can perhaps see from the title. My other slides are more user-friendly, I promise. First, some theoretical considerations. Secondly, some practical issues. And third, some moral considerations.
Wow.
Oh. I don't know how I get these sounds in there. I wonder what the others are that I've embedded. Often when I do this for my students, I have explosions and things. And they go, oh, my. So we're talking today, first theoretically, three issues. The institutional and occupational conceptions of military service from the late and very great Charles Moscas, a friend to many in this room, mentor to several of us I know. Secondly, the military and the family as greedy institutions, and all that implies, and then some work that I did with Charlie and David Siegel on the postmodern military. Oh, thank goodness, quiet one. I'm not going to read these to you, but I should tell you that the slides are available outside the door as a handout, and so note-taking would not be necessary even if you wish to do that. First, the overall conception here is the issue of whether the military is just a job or not. Is it a calling or is it a job? And Charlie's perspective was that you can look at military service as an institution or military service as an occupation. Institutional characteristics are, as you see here, a calling, service to a higher good. These are encapsulated in the great slogans that bind military people together: duty, honor, country, honor, courage, and commitment. All the services have this or their equivalent. And it has also other practical considerations in terms of the way that service members are remunerated and rewarded. And much of the reward is internal, a sense of service. Now, Charlie felt that the military was moving toward occupational considerations, especially in the wake of the all-volunteer force. Technically, actually, the all-recruited force. And if you view military as a job, much as in civilian life, you can then put a price on what military people do. And I know I don't have to convince the people in this room that some of the things that military people are required to do are in fact priceless. First in terms of its value to society, but also in terms of its ability to ever pay in a practical way for what military people and their families are subjected to and for the sacrifices that they make. Now, the implications of this IO model are these for the family members. Now, of course, these are not pure types. You're always somewhere in the middle. These are just, abstractions. But in the institutional model, the spouses have signed up. Well, in a way, they've signed up again. We're moving beyond the occupational model back to the institutional model, as Robert Goldich reminded me. But I'm not an Army guy, but I was told that back in the day, even before my time, there was a place on the officer evaluation reports that would assess the contribution of the spouse to the Army officer's career. That would fit in with this if that was actually true. And of course, the spouses, then almost always wives, would not only participate in flower plantings and other opportunities for fun, they would do it cheerfully, and they would support the organization. Well, there were two stages of withdrawal from this. The first one is the spouses went out and got jobs. First, they had to, because the pay wasn't good enough to support a family as they should be, with certain people even on food stamps. But if you have a job, you don't have opportunity or the time to do these on-base things that serve various functions. Even more critically, spouses did not just have jobs, they had careers. They had professional careers that made it much more difficult for them to move or to be mobile. So that was a change that made a great impact upon the military. Now, the second notion is the notion of greedy institutions. Mady Siegel and others have done some excellent work on this. A greedy institution, if I can get all sociological on you, is a pattern of total devotion. You can devote yourself entirely to the family. You can devote yourself entirely to the military. And each institution has all kinds of motivation to have you do just that. But the problem is that you can't, because you have these conflicts. And you're conflicted by your loyalties and obligations and even love for two very demanding institutions. And so the problem is, how do you balance it? In the institutional model, the military needs would be preeminent. But as we become more occupational, family priorities and the expectations of families increase, and the family assumes its rightful importance as an object of attention for the military and for the individual soldiers. Again, how do you manage those dual loyalties? Some work that I did involves what is happening to the military after the Cold War. And then some other work I've done is after 9/11. There are a list of references on the back of the handout that I'm going to give you if people want to look some more at some of this academic stuff. But clearly, the threat has evolved. It's become much more complicated. The Cold War was very easy conceptually, very hard practically, but conceptually we kind of got it. We've been wargaming it since 1949. We got really good at it. But now the threats have become very diffuse, and the military is not always the obvious instrument with which to deal with them. In this postmodern military, the role of civilians has increased, and personnel issues, including gender and sexual orientation and race previously, are evolving to take account of, frankly, better societal expectations for themselves and for the military. The spouses, although they may be removed from the military and that they're no longer spending all their time there, nevertheless, they are closely networked because they need to stay in touch. This is especially true for reservists who have special problems because they're not on base to take advantage of all these problems. And all of a sudden, reservists who don't know anything about TRICARE find themselves mobilized. Now, they probably figure out by the third mobilization what's happening, because they're being used. But the notion of the career reservist who is on duty every other 6 months has become a reality. But they have special problems with families. Practically, and these are very easy to go through, the strain on military forces is tremendous, active duty and reservists, and this strain is passed through to a strain on the families. Now, even if one didn't care about this from a theoretical or a moral perspective, the families affect the performance of the service members. The family-friendly environment affects how they perform, and it also makes decisions about whether they're going to keep performing that when their enlistment is up or when they can get out. As they say, you recruit soldiers, you re-enlist families. Bob Goldich made the point to me personally that we need to also expand our notion of families, not just the nuclear family or people in the household, but it isn't for nothing that the Navy sponsors a NASCAR vehicle. That's probably directed at the parents as much as it is the prospective enlistees. And the Army adds, you gave him your values, now let him use them. You're talking about the decider. So I think we need to expand the notion of who the family is that we're talking about. Thirdly, the military, however occupational it gets, still is an ecology of moral obligations the society has to the military has to society. Military obligations are clear. Many of them are enshrined in the Uniform Code of Military Justice and other things. The ultimate obligation is to risk injury or ultimately the loss of life in defense of the state. Well, the society has also obligations. Obligations society is not always adequately met. To use forces wisely, respect military personnel, and care for the families. And as Don Inbody, present here today, reminded me, this obligation is not lessened when soldiers are volunteers. It doesn't matter. Volunteers, conscript, they're part of the deal. Now, both the United States and Britain have enshrined these obligations in documents. The U.S. had, back in 2002, a new social compact. I haven't heard a lot about it lately. Lenny Wong and Brad Booth and Matey Siegel put me onto these, and Jim Burke to the British case. There was a Department of Defense initiative with a new social contract. It's there on the website. That has a lot of excellent discussion about the mutual obligations of the families and the military and the special challenges the families face, and underwrites the commitment of the Defense Department reinforces the commitment to underwrite family support. Now, there's a marvelous article also in the references about the British military covenant. British civil-military relations, when I read about them, remind me of what it was like coming for our soldiers who came back from Vietnam, a war that was unpopular, and how they were often disrespected by the civilians. Boy, it was Back to the Future, reading about some things that the British military faced coming back from Iraq and from Afghanistan. It's quite appalling. But the military covenant is an interesting Army initiative, now expanded to all the services, that is a very good expression of mutual obligations. It is true the soldiers put the Army needs first, but the Army and the nation need to treat soldiers fairly. And of course, this has an impact on family. Finally, 5 points. The military is in fact more than just a job. I do regard the military as something special and different, and to whom the society has special responsibilities, and the effect of the family on long and short-term effectiveness is clear. So the need to do military family welfare support is important theoretically, practically, and morally, and I have no problem with any special consideration that could be given to military families. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to open, wow, lights are on. I want to open the floor up for questions. Again, please wait for the microphone and please identify yourself. We have a question right here.
Hi, again. I'm Christina Kaufman, military Army wife, military family advocate. I just wanted to thank you both, and I'm a Berkeley grad, by the way.
Oh, great.
Which begs the question how I ended up an Army wife. My husband went to West Point, I went to Berkeley. We met in the only place those two worlds can come together, Vegas. But that's apparently what happens there doesn't always stay there. Because I had the great time in getting married June 2001. So all I pretty much know is this operational tempo. And I really want to thank you both, because particularly Jennifer, what you were saying about the volunteer, we call it voluntold, that culture that we're living in, and to your point, this antiquated system that we're relying on because more spouses are working, that's one issue, and the younger spouses coming in have a different attitude. They don't have, oftentimes, not all the time, they are saying, I'll take care of my family, you take care of yours. So I think that if we can't really professionalize it to the level it needs to be professionalized, and the Army's response has been to put an FRSA, that's the person that you spoke about. That's a Family Readiness Support Assistant. Okay? Great idea. That person is a GS6. Wow. The job description is an administrative assistant. Okay? The Marines, however, have an FRO, totally different term, Family Readiness Officer. That's a NAF job, but it's an equivalent of a GS9 or 10. I've spoken to the Secretary of the Army, the former one, and we talked about that difference. And what's very frustrating for those of us who have been living on the ground, and I absolutely feel like I colluded with the Army to perpetuate this system, but I had to do it because if I didn't do it, it would not have gotten done. So when my husband was in battalion command at Fort Bragg from 06 to 08, we were deployed the entire time in some capacity. We kept sending them and bringing them back. So we would see the deployment cycle and the impact it had on the families. And it absolutely has to do with national security because that first deployment, we had to bring 3 soldiers home because I, as a volunteer, did not have the resources to keep them from imploding. So for you guys to be talking about it at kind of a educational level, it's very nice for me to hear because sometimes we, particularly the spouses, are the worst offenders of suck it up. Far more so, I think, sometimes than our husbands are. And the senior spouses particularly, there is a, I did it, you should be able to do it. And while I respect the service of all senior spouses, we have never been in this situation before. And my deployment as lieutenant colonel's wife is going to be very different than a deployment from a private or sergeant's wife. I have a higher skill set, I have more resources and such. So I really appreciate the work that you're doing, and I just will say in the op-ed that I wrote last year, that saying, if the Army had wanted you to have a family, it would have issued you one. And there are unbelievable efforts and robust funding. The problem that I've seen is that the misaligned performance measures are measuring success based on money spent and programs created as opposed to what the impact has been. The Marines, I think, have done a little better job at getting things at the unit level. And I know it's because they're smaller, but the Army has more resources. So I think when we're talking about best practices and how we look at what other services are doing, I, as a volunteer, was fielding suicide calls. We've been turned into social workers, emergency first responders, and when I went to Army Community Services to ask them for training on how my key callers would deal with suicide calls, actually, we would call out. That's what true outreach is. We wouldn't let people just call in. We would call out during the deployments. We'd say, how are you doing? And 2 times we had suicide ideations and 2 attempts. This is on the family side. This is not even on the soldier side. When I went to try to get training, they looked at me like I was nuts. So I got the training myself, and I brought it back to my girls, and I did it. But they can't rely on me. It's not a good idea to rely on a girl who decided to do it. So the Army has really done a great job at recognizing and putting resources behind it. But I think we really need to also figure out how to leverage all the nonprofits, because a lot of them I did not hear about until we came up here in DDC, and particularly with the mental health ones like Give an Hour. If I had known about that free mental health care, which is completely outside the system, which is a huge thing, even for the spouses. If I had known about that, I would have been able to pass that along to my family. So it was great to hear you. I know I'm not crazy, and that made me feel much better. Thank you.
I actually have a question for the questioner. Do you ever come across any substance abuse or substance dependency issues in your volunteer work?
Yeah.
Can you talk about that?
I posted a couple weeks ago on my Facebook page, in a particularly trying time, wine plus Army wife equals resiliency. So, yes, I mean, a lot of us are self-medicating, whether that's with alcohol, but I did little straw polls every so often about the girls in our unit, and I would say 80% of us are either on antidepressants, anti-anxiety type of medication, whether or not that's being abused. And I'd like to see numbers behind that, and I don't think we have them yet. You guys probably know more than I do. But, yeah, I mean, one young lady, and this goes to how much resiliency we can expect. One young lady I heard about through 3 deployments, and was just not enough child care available. They're working on that, but it's an issue. And she literally turned the doorknobs around in her house, in the kids' rooms, and locked her kids in so she could leave for a couple hours. So we are turning these girls into felons, basically. And it's not because they started off this way. Mm-hmm. You know, right. So it's but the medication thing is definitely an issue, yeah.
Right, thank you.
If I could just make a comment on something that you said, one of the things that struck me most about what you said was what you said in the beginning of your comment was you referred to the Army operating with an antiquated system. And that really strikes me because I think that what I've actually heard in the back and forth with some of the questions to General Sutton, and that I hear again in what you're saying, what I see in my own research, is that this isn't, that what's happening now is, in fact, stressing systems that weren't created for this kind of a situation. And that answers are probably not to be found in solutions that focus on changing individual mindsets, and they are probably not to be found in tinkering around the edges of existing systems. Probably they are to be found truly in wholesale rethinking of the systems. Now, I understand very well that that would be very difficult in the midst of 2 wars. I get that. For funding reasons, for logistical reasons, for a whole host of reasons. And nevertheless, I mean, I think it raises, what we're going through right now raises the question of whether or not this kind of social support, the kind of social welfare that the military is providing is correctly and adequately structured fundamentally.
And I absolutely agree with you. And the 3 suggestions I made in the op-ed almost a year ago were those organizational and structural changes, and really none of them have happened. One was making sure that in the educational curriculum they're getting family support training. As I mentioned before, I'm training the captains or volunteers are. Put a block on their OER, not for what their spouse is doing, but what they should be accountable for.
Exactly.
Family readiness groups are commanders' programs. Mm-hmm. You say that to a volunteer and most of us roll our eyes because really it's not their fault they're not being trained and they've got 18 other things to do that their boss is telling them is more important. So until you put a block on their OER and then you give them the training and you give them the resources at unit level, it's really a recipe for failure and relying on the volunteers to do it. And your family readiness group will only be as good as your command climate and other factors. Mm-hmm. So it's very frustrating that they're making the effort, but it seems to be missing. My last point I'll say is we are funding an Army-mandated program, the family readiness groups, by baking cupcakes and selling them to our own husbands in the motor pool. We can't even ask. We can't solicit. So, for instance, if I can't call a group and say, hey, we're having a homecoming or we're sending guys away. Every time we sent them, I got teddy bears for the kids to hold on to. Little thing, huge difference to have them hold on to something. And every 6 months, out of pocket, and commanders are spending thousands of dollars on this, so you know it's important. That's ridiculous that we're still doing that. The Marines don't do that. The Marines get $25 per soldier from the MWR, NAF, and appropriated funds. The Army gets $3, and we can only use that when the guys are back. We can't use that when they're away. So, again, I don't want to. I always lead with kind of the bad stuff, but the Army's trying. I just think the efforts are kind of, like you said, nibbling around the edges.
We have another question in the back there.
Hi, Kathy Roth-Duquet. I'm a Marine Corps spouse, and I wanted to echo what Chris was saying. I do think the Army should go to the Marine Corps model. I think it's much, much, much more successful, and that's one of the reasons we have different services is to see how different things work. 2 points I want to make is, You know, I love the covenant that you talked about. And John, I loved your presentation. But I think the covenant's not between the military family, and the DOD. It's between the military and society. Mm-hmm. We don't serve to help the DOD. We serve to help America. And what we need to do is bring in the rest of the country. Because I think what's most isolating for us is the feeling that 1% of the people are doing a lot of the heavy lifting, and the rest of people have often seemed to have forgotten that there is a war going on. And I think we need to look for solutions outside of DOD, because I also want the Defense Department to make sure my husband's properly equipped and trained, and I don't necessarily want, in this time of tight budgets, $3 billion spent on different kinds of spouse programs. I want us to look at the resources outside that aren't tapped very much, and maybe with the help of government or help of other institutions, bring more of that support in. And then to speak about the mental health and the medication issue, I'm with Blue Star Families. We are, because we have a 501c3, we're the same people who are in our Fairgies, but we're allowed to ask for people to donate cupcakes or donate things, because we go outside the military and we have a tax status that lets us do that. But when we ask our members, I would say the vast majority of our members have been medicated at some point. But I don't think that's a terrible thing. Mm-hmm. I think that I like what DCoE is doing in destigmatizing. I mean, if you're the person who you love and for whom your happiness depends is in harm's way for 7 or 12 or 15 months, I defy you not to be depressed and anxious sometimes. I'm about as privileged and prepared as they come. I've got a law degree. I went to good schools. But, I mean, in my husband's current deployment, this is his 3rd combat deployment. He's in Afghanistan now. I have found myself feeling about as low and worthless as I've ever felt in my life at one point. I don't think it's terrible that we experience those feelings and learn how to approach them and even seek medication if we do for them. 30% of our kids get neglected during deployment. Well, yeah, how could that not happen? You know, I have to tell you, my kids don't get the same meals now that they used to. I think neglect is an ugly word. Sometimes it goes to the point where it's a felony, as Chrissy was talking about, but sometimes it's just you're not being the kind of parent you want to be. We need to figure out how to bolster that, being aware that that's a natural thing to happen in these situations, and to take, again, the stigma of that away. And, by the way, I think this is something the larger society can learn from us, too, because it's not as though these kinds of stresses aren't happening in the outside world. They may not be as dramatic because of the war, but this is something all of us need to kind of do a better job dealing with. But thank you very much for the work you're doing.
Thank you.
We have a question in the back here.
Hi, Joyce Razor with National Military Family Association, Army spouse. So some of my comments I would echo, I would just echo. So I'm going to say ditto to Kathy and Christina and talk about a couple other things. I think thank you for recognizing that a lot of this change has been driven by spouses in history. My organization was founded in 1969 when it was common for military spouses to only go to teas and coffees, and our founding mothers put on their hats and gloves and went up to Capitol Hill and got the survivor benefit plan. Mm-hmm. So, and some of our folks were involved in those early Army efforts, and we hold them up as heroes. And in my view of all of this, and I think your research and your conversation, you've talked about it, and the difference and the kind of dichotomy between is service a calling or a career or a job. And I think the Army, in terms of the military, in terms of how they viewed family programs, has been kind of the same way. Is caring for families a readiness issue, or is caring for families an employer-sponsor benefit? Mm. And they don't often get that right. One example that really drove this home to me, there at one point a couple years ago, people were asking, why do we have so many pediatricians in the military health system? Why don't we just contract out and send our families to pediatricians downtown? Why do we need pediatricians? So when I started asking military medical people, okay, what is the role of the pediatrician, the uniformed pediatrician in the military today? I got 3 answers, and I got them just pretty much consistently, evenly divided. One answer was, We have pediatricians because it is the right thing to do for the military to have medical professionals to care for the children of our service members who are in harm's way. That's one answer. Second answer, occurred just as frequently, was there's no readiness reason why we need military pediatricians. The third reason was we need pediatricians. We need pediatricians to deploy, either to take care of our service members, who some of them are just adolescents themselves, or to take care of folks in disasters, tsunamis, earthquakes, whatever. So the military medical profession cannot agree on why they need pediatricians in the military. That's just one example of how the military can't come to grips with what support for families is because of the war, because of the deployments, because of the service of the military member, and the need to care for the family because of that service, and what is just a nice thing for an employer to offer an employee. And until the military can come to grips with that issue, I think we're going to have these problems, and I think you're going to continue to hear from military spouses leading the way to say, military, get it right.
Thank you. We have another question here in the back.
Thank you. My name is Molly Blake. I am a Marine Corps spouse. I'm also a member of Blue Star Families. I do appreciate the research that you are doing, and Shelley, Dr. Wadsworth over there, I heard her speak last week, and I think it's tremendous. I would challenge you, though, to perhaps encourage more spouses and active duty families to join in these conversations like we're having here today. I'm an active duty spouse. My husband's going to deploy in a year. We're about to take command of a Harrier squadron in Yuma, and we are way out of the loop over there. And so I would challenge you to bring in more of us to these conversations. We are educated, we are intelligent, and we have great ideas. And I think that there's very few uniforms in this room, and I don't know how many active duty spouses are in here, but you know, we are the ones you're speaking of, and all of your ideas are wonderful, and I do appreciate the research, but again, I challenge you to welcome us into these conversations, perhaps a little bit more easily, just so you can get our opinions. We're happy to talk to you. I'm a pretty good PR person for the Marine Corps and Marine Corps spouses. I'm very proud of it, and I would be happy to talk and answer any questions as well. So thank you.
You know, I think this is interesting what you said, and also Kathy. First, the notion of the whole societal perspective. The covenant is, in fact, between society and the military. DoD is an important link, but we mustn't forget that that's the big picture, something that you, Kathy, have pointed out consistently in your own excellent work. And it's also a mistake, as you pointed out, I think, just now, to view spouses as objects rather than as actors. Men and women now. People who are taking a responsibility for their own lives and the lives of others around them, rather than people for whom you do things for whatever reason. I think that's a very important perspective, and was brought out in the Family Strong video.
Yeah, and also just brought out in my own research. I mean, I wouldn't dare to treat a military spouse as an object, given what I've learned about them. I mean, I'm a historian, so I work mostly with documents and the things left behind by military spouses after the fact, whether they be their letters, things that they leave, you know, at the war colleges when they come in and do workshops, surveys, all kinds of other stuff. But you know, we should be honest. I mean, academia is a really different world, and for me coming into this with absolutely, we have no family history in my family of military service. I have no personal relationship whatsoever to the military. And I have been basically on a 5-year learning curve. Now, I have had the opportunity to present my work a lot to active duty people. They've been mostly people in uniform. And so actually it hasn't been to spouses. And when I have talked with spouses, it's just been through kind of networking. And I've been fortunate to be able to do oral histories with some senior Army spouses. But it's all been kind of catch as catch can. And it is kind of difficult to know how to bridge those two worlds. So maybe one of the things that if we have a chance we could talk about ways that we could do that.
Absolutely.
Can I comment on that? Well, and I do think there's a big disconnect, too, between the very high upper echelon of services and then there's the very low enlisted young families. And then there's this massive chunk of people in the middle, and that's exactly where I am. We're just in 05. My husband's a lieutenant colonel, but we are in the trenches. This will be our 5th deployment, and that's fine. I don't complain about that. That's not my issue. It's not, like Kathy said, let's not just throw buckets of money at these problems. We're this whole spouse group. We've been othered for so long, and we're sort of a new group that's suddenly been recognized, and we certainly appreciate that. But as Dr. Wadsworth is continuing to study us, but there's a big group of people in the middle who are the ones that can definitely join in this conversation, and they have great things to say, and they have great ideas. So again, I hope you do consider involving us in this conversation.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Social media.
Yeah, right.
Facebook.
I lurk on the blogs, I lurk there on the Army Wives blogs. I do lots of lurking, but I haven't actually.
Well, much to the astonishment and horror of my students, I'm on Facebook, and I tell them, if you don't like that, change your privacy settings.
Yeah, really.
They can friend me if they want.
Historical documentation for what just happened with the MyCA, the spouse tuition thing, that was driven from Facebook.
Right.
That's interesting.
Right. I want to work the room. We have plenty of time for all the questions. I want to move to Flip down here in the front.
Thank you. Philippa Strum from the Wilson Center. Thank you both so much. This has been really illuminating for somebody who's not in the military and doesn't come from a military family, but cares very much about public policy. Jennifer, I wonder if you could talk a little bit, and perhaps Dr. Williams, you would like to as well, about how we put this in the context of the Army and the military, beyond the Army, attitude towards gender. Because it seems to me that rather obvious that if women had been soldiers all along, family policies would be quite different. And I was struck by looking at the video that you showed. I understand that we've got a very small percentage of women in the Army, but nonetheless, the people who were portrayed as the soldiers were, unless I missed the slide or two, with one exception, maybe two, were all men. And I'm struck also listening to the military wives in the room about the volunteerism that is expected of spouses. Well, traditionally, we've expected volunteerism from women, but not from men. I don't think we would expect the male spouses to be making cupcakes to raise the money that's necessary to support families. So how do you put this in the whole context of the military's attitude towards gender generally?
Well, when I said that there were many different ways in which you could measure or chart the military's reluctance to sort of fully extend itself to families, I think one of the ways that I didn't mention, but that I could discuss now, does have very much to do with gender. At the same moment that the Army was facing the realities that it had to provide more for soldiers' families, that was the same moment, if we remember back, when women were being brought into the volunteer force in great numbers. And of course they were being brought into the volunteer force in great numbers because that was the only way to make the volunteer force viable. If you weren't going to draft, you were going to have to allow more women in. And their percentage in the 1980s increased like 1,300%. It was enormous. There was ambivalence about this. There was not just ambivalence, there was anger about this among some in the military, and frustration about it. And one of the things that I found curious in looking through the history was how often these family programs, even though they were primarily going to serve male soldiers' families, how often they were associated with women. How often they were associated with, now that we have women soldiers, now we need daycare. And very prominent people got up before, Congress and said things like, we're turning the Army into a babysitting service. And there were real gender connotations there that had to do with not wanting to feminize the military. And the programs that supported families were seen as doing that, as turning the Army into a babysitting service. And although I think the Army has come a long way, and now, for example, embraces its childcare, which of course is the best childcare in the nation. I think that some of the residual feelings that this really isn't the important stuff that the Army does, and this is really something that we just have to do. And it's those spouses who are whining, or it's the female soldiers who have the kids, that kind of makes this necessary. My evidence tells me that those feelings are not gone, and that those feelings have an effect in willingness to spend money, in willingness to make, not just to spend money, but to designate the funds to be spent in a certain way, right? And also in the structures, that were being talked about, whether or not these are still essentially voluntary structures, or whether they're professionally staffed and reorganized according to the real needs of women. So I see that as one of the major ways in which the Army's commitment to families has been limited and conditioned, is because of the influence of gender beliefs.
Actually, I've seen an enormous improvement in the evolution of attitudes toward women and their contribution to the military. It was truly appalling what some of the attitudes were when I came in, but now everybody understands that they're not going to fight and win the nation's wars without the irreplaceable contribution of women in uniform and out of it. Now, the conversation as to whether women should be involved in close combat is still ahead of us, and I think reasonable people will differ on that. I think that the integration of women in that way, and gender integration, is in some ways more difficult than issues of sexual orientation, for reasons we don't have time to get into today. But there's going to be some problems. So we're putting women on submarines. Realistically, a lot of the wives don't like it. Well, it becomes a family issue. And it doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. It's time we did it. I agree. But we need to do any of these social changes in full knowledge of the kinds of problems that are almost certain to arise. And I think that military does well to study these things carefully.
Our final question in the back here. Oh, yeah. If you could just wait for the microphone, I'm sorry.
I'm interested in the expertise. I'm sorry, I'm Shelley McDermott Wadsworth. I direct the Military Family Research Institute at Purdue University. I'm interested in your perspectives from your academic frame of reference. So I spend a lot of time with corporate folks. I've just come here from a meeting with corporate folks, and they spend time thinking about family supportive programs and policies just as we are here. And there are two themes that come up in that discussion that have also routinely come up in discussions about welfare state policies in Europe and in this country around welfare reform, and also in organizations over a long period of time. And that is, where is the line beyond which creating entitlements reduces initiative? In other words, when are programs and policies that are being offered truly helpful, and is there a point beyond which they're incenting the wrong kind of behavior? And I ask that as an academic question. I don't have a position on it, but I'm interested in your expertise. And the second theme, which is related, is to what extent are organizations obligated to be realistic about what they can promise?
It's difficult to answer in the abstract, so I'll save a whole lot of time and not try it, except to say that is very important. Those are, in fact, the questions. What sort of behaviors are you incentivizing by your reward structure? And as we change entitlements for civilians and others, we need to bear that in mind. Organizations need, though, to be aware of what their purpose is. In the case of the military, it's to fight and win our nation's wars. And all the other things that go on are related to that, but ancillary to it and subordinate to it.
Jonathan?
I hate to say that I can't come up with an answer for this, but I sort of want to answer in two different ways, and I'm trying to decide how I want to answer. I think the first thing is the question that you raise, that you say that corporations are dealing with, and you see it in public policy as well. I think from my perspective as a historian, I would sort of want to historicize that question, which is that, I believe that that's a question that comes very much out of politics and public policy, I think more of the last 30 years, which is that we tend not to ask how we can make people to improve their welfare and make people safe and secure. We tend to ask more about whether spending money on someone will produce a certain behavior or not produce a certain behavior. So that hasn't always been a question, in other words, I want to say, for institutions, for corporations, or for the military. I don't think it's a trans-historical question. I think it's a question of more recent times. And because of that, then, I personally tend to be, I'm not going to dismiss it, I tend to be skeptical of the nature of the question. I think sometimes the motivation behind that is, I don't want people to rely on me. I don't want people to rely too much on this. And while I understand that there are limits in budgets, and I understand that there are limits to what can be provided, I think that if you come at it from a social welfare angle and you think about whether the institution with which a person is involved itself creates serious pressures for people who are members of it or participating in it, and what can be done about that, I don't think the question gets asked in the same way. And in the case of the military right now, and historically, it produces very specific and unusual and unique pressures in people's lives, and dare I say, social welfare problems that aren't of an individual nature. They're broadly felt among groups of people. And I think maybe I'm just reluctant to ask that question. I mean, you saw that I was reluctant about the whole question of promoting self-reliance. I feel a little reluctant about taking that tact with it, sort of from a historical and ideological perspective.
I understand your reluctance, and I share it, but it is a reality of trying to make policy, and there's no. I would dispute the idea that I mean, I think it's very historically relevant in that most federal policies that have ever been made have been made with the goal. You're the historian, not me. But government policies are often made with the goal of incentivizing certain kinds of behaviors.
Yes.
And women were encouraged into the war effort in World War II using a variety of kinds of policies and programs, and they were incentivized out of it at the end. So the question is being asked, and the question is being answered. We may not like the answer, but I think engaging the question would be very helpful through the lens of history.
I'll try to do a better job.
I can see that this is a conversation that's going to persist during the coffee break. I want to thank our panelists, and I hope everyone joins me in thanking the panelists.